A widow sold because she couldn't conceive, but the rancher with a baby girl asked her to stay. The dusty marketplace was alive with chatter, bartering, and the restless whinnying of horses. Among the stalls, a woman stood still, like a single flame burning low in the wind. Her name was Clara, a widow whose fate had been cruelly tied not to her character or her kindness, but to something she could not control, her inability to bear children. In her small, unforgiving town, she had been cast aside, spoken of in whispers, and ultimately sold to repay her late husband's debts. To the townspeople, she was no more than a burden shuffled from one hand to another. But in her eyes, behind the quiet sorrow, there was still dignity, fragile, but unbroken. The man who took her was Ruthless Reed, a rancher known more for his booming cattle empire than his warmth. He'd been widowed himself, left with a baby girl after his wife's sudden passing. Most folk said Reed bought Clara not out of need but convenience, someone to tend to his child while he worked his lands. Yet Clara, stepping onto his ranch, felt only shame pressing against her chest, her heart whispering she was nothing but a placeholder for a role she could never truly fill. But little Annie, the rancher's daughter, had other plans. The tiny girl with golden curls and eyes as wide as the Texas sky clung to Clara's skirt the moment she arrived. At first, Clara froze, uncertain how to cradle a life she believed she could never nurture. Yet Annie's trust was immediate, her arms warm, her laughter bubbling whenever Clara whispered a lullaby or traced little hearts into her palms. In those quiet moments, Clara felt a faint flicker of something she hadn't dared to believe in, belonging. Reed was harder to read. His days were spent in the saddle, his nights at the ledger, tallying profits and losses. He spoke little, his voice clipped, his grief tightly buttoned beneath his rugged exterior. To Clara, he was a storm cloud, close but unreachable. She assumed he saw her as the rest of the town did, barren, broken, and useful only for keeping Annie fed and safe. But then came the night of the fever. Annie's tiny body burned hot against Clara's arms, her cough rattling through the silence. Panic rose in Clara like a tidal wave. Without waiting for permission, she sat by Annie's bed for hours, pressing cool cloths to her brow, rocking her, praying aloud though no one was listening. When Reed burst into the room near dawn, sweat dripping from his brow after racing to fetch the doctor, he found not a servant, not a stranger, but Clara, eyes red, lips trembling, holding Annie as if the child had been her own. For the first time, Reed saw her differently. He didn't speak that night, but when Annie's fever broke and sleep finally softened her breaths, he placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder. It wasn't the touch of an employer. It was the silent gratitude of a father who had witnessed a miracle of devotion. Days passed, and Reed began to notice other things. The way Clara taught Annie to braid her hair, the way she stitched torn shirts without being asked, the way her laughter returned life to a house that had long echoed with silence. He realized he had bought a widow, but what had entered his home was a woman who gave without expecting anything in return. One evening, under the bleeding hues of a Texas sunset, Reed approached Clara by the barn. She was humming softly, Annie asleep in her arms. He hesitated, then said the words that had been tugging at him for weeks. "Clara, I need to ask you something. You came here because this town gave you no choice. But I'm asking now. Not as a rancher, not as a man who paid a debt, but as a father and as someone who sees your worth. Will you stay? Not because you must, but because you want to." Clara's eyes welled with tears. She thought of all the times she had been told she was less of a woman, less of a wife, less of a person. And yet here was a man, holding out not chains, but freedom. She looked down at Annie, whose tiny hand still gripped her blouse even in sleep, and knew her answer was not bound in shame but in love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears. "I will stay." From that day forward, Clara was no longer the widow defined by what she could not give. She became the heartbeat of the ranch, a mother to Annie, and a partner to Reed, not through contracts or debts, but through the quiet, unshakable power of compassion. In time, the town that had once pitted her began to envy her. They saw the laughter that drifted from Reed's home, the strength of a family rebuilt not by blood but by choice. And Clara, for the first time, believed she was exactly where she was meant to be. Because sometimes, the truest families are not born, but chosen. And sometimes, the greatest gift a person can give is not life itself, but the love that makes life worth living.